Welcome to talk about the sorry state of state media, a new report by the Center for Media, Data and Society of Central European University. Here are Marius Dragomir, the mastermind behind the report, as well as Astrid Söderström, the co-author of the report, and I'm Minna Aslama from the University of Helsinki, asking the questions on behalf of all of us. But please do feel free to ask any questions, give any comments on chats here on Zoom or on Facebook. Judith will help us to monitor the questions from everybody. But for those who haven't had a chance to look at this brand new report, I believe it's a couple of weeks old only. What is it about? Marius Dragomir, what do you mean by the sorry state of state media?
Well, this is a report that collects findings of a much longer research effort that I have been part of in various teams. I started it. I realized 17, 18 years ago, and I was working with the Open Society Foundations. Back then, I was in charge of their research initiatives. And what happened, what I did was to collect information about media outlets all over the world. And I tried to make sense of how they operate and to classify them into a state media database, a commercial media database. I also at some point collected information about community media and other types of media. So this is a longer effort. But what happened, what this is about is a new an effort to understand the latest trends in the state media all over the world, to understand what happened with them on various levels, with their editorial independence, what happened with their funding, what happened with their governing structures, and how independent they are from political bodies and authorities. So this is what you have in this report. It's a collection of facts about state media in 151 countries. It has been conducted over the latest round of research over the last 1 year and a half, 2 years, and is essentially just one or the most general take on state media. There are several other papers that are scheduled to be published in the next year as part of the same effort.
Wonderful. So this is really a labor of love of many decades with an updated, very recent information. But everybody's talking about platformization and platform power. Why now state media? What prompted you to look at the sorry state right now?
Well, I think it's as researchers, and you know that very well, we look at relevant things in our field, and sometimes we have to be opportunistic as well. We study things that are very relevant for a certain period in time. But overall, I think it's really important to look at the state media, because they are a very important player, and there are various reasons there. Let me just refer to 3 or 4. The first thing is very important to understand the state media now and ever, essentially, because it's about heavy public resources that are involved there. In many countries, we talk about state funding. In other countries, we talk about revenues generated by people. So it's very important to study them and to keep an eye on that for these transparency purposes. Secondly, I think it's important because these state media in many countries have a major impact on the market, and not necessarily a bad one. In some countries, if you have independent public service media, they actually push the levels of quality in the media higher, also among private media and commercial media. But in many countries, because they receive substantial funding from the state, they can have a distorting effect on the market, in the overall competition with other media outlets. The third reason is ideological, I would call it, and this is because in many countries, these outlets, and we live in an era of disinformation and all that, and in many countries, the disinformation comes from these players. So I think it's really important to study them, to really understand who these players are, because in many places they shape the narrative, they control the narrative. And finally, and that's quite a basic take of it. I think another fourth reason to constantly look at and analyze state media is the fact that they are a very large player. In many countries, as we have seen, they play a very important role, and that can be both negative and positive. And this is something that this paper tried to capture.
Just for everybody, Judith is sharing the link to the report here on chat on Zoom and as well as on Facebook. So those who haven't yet downloaded it, go quick. Yeah, Marius, I know you've done a lot of work and kind of groundbreaking work, if I may say so, on media capture. So I'm wondering, when you're talking about the state of state media, you refer to media capture quite a bit, and can you explain really briefly what you mean by media capture and whether you see it as a trend, whether the role of state media is actually greater now because of the phenomenon of state media capture?
Yes, well, I think we have to look at the capture from 2 points of view. On the one hand is the larger phenomenon of media capture, about which we have written quite a lot of studies, and we define the media capture as a sum of 4 key elements. I'm not going into detail now, but just very briefly, it's about the state, the situation when governments and private actors, usually companies and businesses associated with governments, take over 4 things. One is the regulation, and this is when regulation becomes politicized. Second is when they take over state media and they control it through various ways. Funding and appointment of management structures are 2 of the key things. The third is use of public resources, or misuse, better being put, is misuse of public resources to control media. And the fourth is when they take over private media. So this is like the phenomenon of media capture that we are studying, and we are seeing in an increasing number of countries. It's very serious, because if all of you who are in the media, if you think about regulation, public resources, state media and private media, most of it being taken over, you basically leave almost no space for independent journalism. So this is the phenomenon. And yes, in countries where you have state-controlled media, it's worse. Secondly, I think what is new in this study is the fact that we try to look at to classify, to categorize the media beyond the dichotomy, the state-controlled media, the typical Chinese, the Russian-controlled media, and then on the other hand, independent public media, the public media to which many in the Western world aspire. In between, there are a number of models that are more or less independent, and in that, in this package of models, we have a model that it has to do with capture, and we have 2 models there. We can talk about that if there is more interest, but it's explained in detail. We have the model of public service media that are captured, and that happens when the editorial independence is being controlled by the government, and they basically fall into a worse category, so to speak. And then we have the private media capture, and these are media outlets that usually are private, but because of funding or management links, they become controlled by those groups of, it's not only government officials or government representatives or institutions, but a combination of government people, authorities, and businesses. So looking at media capture, yes, in environments where the media capture is higher, the role of the governments is usually higher, and the role of the state media is very negative. And on the other hand, I think the capture is very useful because it gives us more nuance, us meaning not only researchers but also journalists and people interested in the state of state media, to really understand how they operate and how independent they are, essentially.
Yeah, talking about the new model that you have created, that was fascinating, and as a public service media researcher for 20-some years, kind of shocking. Also, can we talk about the model? I'm wondering, Marius, if you have a slide about that, because that might also illustrate a little bit of the different categories. I do understand the category of sort of state-funded, fully controlled media, and your key ways to categorize this. So one is funding, one is sort of governance or management, and one is editorial control, right? Mm-hmm. And I understand that that can be totally controlled, but that can be, or that can be completely independent. But you still have a huge variety of five categories in between. What, for instance, do you mean fully state-controlled media vis-a-vis, let's say, captured public or state-managed media? What's the difference between those two?
Well, first of all, I'll be trying to share the screen. I don't have the rights, but I hope my colleagues will have me. But indeed, I think it's when you look at the model, I think it's important to look at and we chose to look at these three aspects: funding, governance structures, and ownership, which is the second, and editorial independence. Also, because I believe, and there is a lot of literature that was written about that in the past 3 decades, these are the key areas where you can see control. So what we are trying to actually capture through this model is the control. Also, when you look at this matrix, you have, and it is presented in the study, you basically have the 7 models that you have there, ranging from the state control media, which is the worst, to the independent public media, which is the best, is essentially a combination of these 3 factors. Now, very briefly, what happened there, and this has been done through empirical research in each of the countries, in each of the state media that we have covered. What we tried on, we've identified a few positive factors and negative factors in the 3 buckets of criteria. When it comes to funding, and it's a long discussion, what we looked at, for example, was what we identified was the fact that when you have at least 50% of the budget coming from the government, usually you have a sort of financial control of the media outlet. So that was one of the criteria used there. On the other hand, we also analyzed the type of funding, and we noticed that in countries where you have the public more connected with the state media, you have more independence. For example, countries that have public media which are financed through the license fee, for example, have more independent public media. So we played with all these factors, and we have a detailed methodology about the study looking into that. The second thing, when it comes to governing structures and ownership, and this is something that I know many of you are familiar with, this is the situation where authorities and governments, state authorities and governments, they are appointing people, and they control the media through, the boards of directors, to the management structures and all that. And again, here we looked at various things. For example, in countries where most of the members are appointed by one state authority, the state media tends to be more controlled. And of course, in countries where you have, for example, the composition of this body is more diverse, with civil society, for example, involved in that more, you have a higher level of independence. So, and this is the second bucket of factors. And finally, the editorial control, and this is the most difficult actually to study, because in the others you can find information, you can use various methods, but with the editorial control, it's very difficult. And in fact, that makes this matrix a living body. It's not, this paper is published today, and it consists of the findings in the last year of research, but things are changing very fast. In some countries, not. And this is another discussion. Things haven't changed for 30 years in some countries, unfortunately. But in other countries, they change, and you have to actually, some state media, they fall from one category to another. So if you look at these 3 factors, we get the following, and I think now I can share the screen. We get a situation where we have essentially 7 models, 7 types of state media. Again, they range from state control media, and here you have essentially those media outlets where the state funds them in majority, and in many cases, like the full budget comes from the state budget. The second is the control of governing structures, and again, in this situation, you have all the people managing and governing the media outlet appointed by state authorities. And editorial control, In most of these cases, these are propaganda channels and they have a mission. In many cases, it's even written. And again, I'm referring to some of the Chinese, the Russian state-owned and controlled media, where the control is achieved through direct mechanisms. When it comes to independent public media, and again, I'm not going to insist on that, you don't have any of that. You have like funding models such as license fee, or now there are models through taxes where you have a connection with the public, and the disconnection, these are models that prevent politicians to interfering with this model. You have structures of governance that are very diverse, as I said, and you have a lot of mechanisms and tools in place in the media that prevent these players into interfering. So you don't have essentially any control. And in between, what you have is a number of models. You have independent state managed media, for example, where you have the element of governing structures present, but they are not funded in majority by the state, and they are not editorially controlled. You have the independent, I think they are self describing, independent state funded media. We wanted to give them names, but for now we just leave them, as such, defined very clearly. And what is important in this matrix, I think, is the fact that the differentiating factor is the editorial control. I think what is here under the yellowish, highlighted in yellowish, are the media outlets, the state media outlets that have editorial independence and can be, are moving within these categories from better to worse. There is nothing like the worst in this category, in this 4-category classification. The problem, I think, here is with the type of independent state funding and state managed media, because imagine if the government has the financial control and has the control of the governance structures, these media outlets are the most vulnerable, because immediately they can have the governments and authorities can have an impact on their editorial line. And then when you go into the editorially controlled media, you have, besides the state controlled media, which I think we can all recognize, you have the captured, on the one hand, public state managed media, and here usually we have public broadcasters that stop doing their mission, and their editorial coverage and agenda is being controlled by the government. And then we have the captured private media, and this is an outlier in the study, because these are essentially private media owned by oligarchs or by companies that are close to the government. So essentially, you don't have any state any state connection or element, but there is a connection at the editorial level, where state authorities are managing to control that for many reasons. And this is the case of countries countries with a history of state interventionism, more or less. And we look at countries like Turkey. We look at countries like unfortunately in Europe, like Hungary and Poland. We look at countries like Cambodia, Jordan, and some others. So this is essentially what the model, what the matrix looks like. What I wanted to, but I guess you will talk about that, is how what is the picture of the media that is classified according to this criteria, but maybe we can talk about that later.
Yeah, indeed, that was one of my questions, so we can jump right into that. I personally think that this is a very interesting and also a very, how would I say, normative and political way of classifying these media. For instance, I'm sure that well, it was a little bit of a shock to me, although I know it, but when it's categorized this way, that YLE from Finland isn't exactly the independent of the most independent, because there is the relationship to funding and so on and so forth. I think it's a very daring model, personally, but we can get back to that. I also found it so fascinating how different regions seem to be very sort of defined. So I think at the end of your report, the very last map of the world is a really interesting one. If you want to show us, and with a broad brush, tell us a little bit about how different regions look like when analyzed through these 7 categories. What is typical to each region? I think it was right there at the end of the report, Marius, if you would.
Yes, I will just try to look at that. Yes. Here you are. Yes.
Exactly. Tell us a little bit about the different regions. Obviously, when we look at Europe, we see that the color coding tells us that there's a variety of types of state public media, that the scale is the largest. But can you tell about a little bit of the different regions?
Of course. Yeah, well, I think by now, those present and those who looked at the study see that what we have here, the gray is actually the gray areas, the grim areas, and what we have in these yellowish hues are the countries that have various forms of editorially independent state media. This is one. First of all, the overall picture, I think, having gray everywhere is quite troubling, and this is one of the most striking findings of the study. For some of the people who are in the field for many years, is not that striking. I was talking to experts in various countries, and again, they didn't find anything extraordinary here, because, as I said, there are countries where nothing happened for many years. And this is something that I think at some point we are planning to look at historically. Of course, it's a huge undertaking to look at all these countries and see what happened over the past, I don't know, 30 years, because you have to go back and you have to find information from those times. But it is something that I think would explain many things. But from the top of my head, and based on the experience I had in some of these countries, I think what is extremely troubling, yes, is the overall picture. The second is that, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, which has very few state media that are really independent, and no really independent public media, nothing has happened for decades. And the same can be said, for example, about countries in Eurasia, as we classify the countries from the former sphere of influence of the former Soviet Union. The same can be said about many countries in Southeast Asia. And also maybe about some countries in Latin America. What is common, for example, for Latin America is the fact that there are many more independent public media. The issue in Latin America is the fact that many of them are university broadcasters, and they do, some of them, a very good job. And it's great that they have this independence, but the independence is not really a sign that you have a healthy media environment. They are independent because they are not, in some countries, in most of the countries, very influential. So in other words, the government is happy to give them some money through the universities and let them be. What I can also notice regarding Europe, yes, it is obviously the most diverse area in the study, and again, it's something that quite expected. But I would also draw the attention to the fact that there are, yes, we have a lot of public media here, and we have a lot of independent public media here. The problem with Europe is that we see a trend where the government control in the state media has been increasing. We see countries that are struggling with media capture. So the problem with Europe is that it is not that it hosts the few independent public media in the world, but we see a lot of threats, and we can see these threats in some Western European countries. Unfortunately, some years ago there was an attack on the public television in Austria, which is an independent public broadcaster. We saw similar debates and attempts to trim the budget of the Danish public broadcaster, and of course we see the discussion in the UK with a number of forces that are literally attacking the integrity of the BBC. So I think that is something that to look ahead, and one of the worrying trends. Of course, I have to also highlight the fact that when you look at the independent public service media, this is essentially a European phenomenon, and most of the public media, 18 I think we counted, which is a very low number, most of them are in Western Europe. On the other hand, there are some good signs, for example, in countries like Albania, the Czech Republic, Lithuania, where you have public media that are independent. But overall, I think it's the situation is quite worrying. And of course, you can go now into details. There is a very interesting analysis that you can make on sub-Saharan Africa, going to various parts, Eastern Africa, Southern Africa, Western Africa. You can find very granular trends there. You can go to Southeast Asia and find various models, and we can talk about, for example, the threats at public broadcast, what essentially used to be a public broadcaster in Japan. So there are many things to talk about, but overall I think it's a grim situation, and although we see some improvements in some areas in many countries, there are many threats, unfortunately.
Okay, it is a grim situation, and something that I was thinking about, and I was wondering whether it should be included somehow in this kind of analysis is, of course, the issue which a lot of mature public service broadcasting countries, as well as others with emerging sort of public interest, public service media have been struggling. And that is, of course, do we talk about public service broadcasting or public service media? Right. Yeah. And the ability of these organizations actually have a significant online presence vis-a-vis, getting your news from Facebook. So I know you didn't really address that directly, but what are some observations along the way?
Well, I think it's that's a great question, and probably one of the most important questions we should answer today, these days. What we see here, and I agree with you, it is a political study, because what we looked at was the editorial independence from political and other types of interests. And of course, I think there will be many people who will argue with the classification, who will say that they are not in that category, but in the other, and all that. But I think what is really important is to really look through these models and try to understand what is the role of the public media in the future. On the one hand, I think, and there is already a lot of literature that is being written about the platformization of the media, I think public media have to actually adjust much faster to the technological advances that we are seeing, and it's happening. The problem there is that it's happening again in more affluent societies, in richer markets where they have the opportunity and the resources to do that, and it doesn't happen at all in other countries. So this is one thing. Secondly, I think it's really yes, the picture that we present here is very grim, it's very bleak, but on the other hand, I think this really, while we were doing the research, we again understood again and again how important is the role of public media in the world. It's essential. It's the most important thing that is happening today. If the public service model collapses, we actually have nothing, because it's the new models of media consumption, people taking information from social media and all that. These are distribution companies. They are not content providers. What is really important, and especially in a context where we see the spread of the media capture model, where we see the spread of the model of propaganda media outlets that are being created by countries for audiences abroad, we can see increasingly how much we need to recreate the space for independent journalism. And of course, the situation is more nuanced than I presented here, but I think overall, it is in many countries, it is the role of the public service media to save independent journalism and to save the quality content that we want for the future. That being said, I think what we look at is I cannot really see, while I was doing this round of research, I couldn't really see how I can see how in some Western European countries public media can grow into a modern platformized media that will be able to compete even with foreign streaming service and all that. I see that they have a very powerful position in the news market, especially in, look at countries like Germany and the Nordic countries, and of course they will not lose that very easily. They are very well positioned because of the resources to actually grow and preserve a lot of the public service principles that guided the creation of the public media. But then if you look at the other countries, I cannot see anything. You know, there is like a series of failures across Central and Eastern Europe. There was an attempt 20 years ago among some African countries to redevelop the state media sector into a public media sector. I think it miserably failed. And when you look at these outlets at this moment in time, I really can see how they can get out of that and become, you know, a modern public service media platform.
I got a note from Sally Ann Wilson from Public Media Alliance that this is a fantastic research, and she has several questions. Sally Ann, might you want to ask at least one of them right now?
It's fantastic, and I mean, PMA has been doing a similar exercise in scoping. My colleagues have been scoping public media worldwide. We were prompted by the Facebook suggestion of categorizing state media. I'm very glad that you agree that there are many that are in the grey area in the middle. Not the grey area as you've categorized it, but an area, and we want to encompass diversity. And I think mostly we would agree with your categorizations. I think one of the things that concerns us at the moment is things are changing more quickly than they have before. And we are faced with a situation where a public media organization can change overnight. RTM in Malaysia, we've worked with them for years. They are our members. We agree now they're state controlled. They were state controlled. Then literally overnight with the change in government, they were very much public media again. And many of our colleagues who work there understand the principles of public media and try to stick to it. So it would be great to see more discussion and work around how we work with those journalists who are, I mean, Slovenia is another case in point, where you have some great journalists, even at quite senior level, who are being eroded away from the top. But actually the core of the organization are public media journalists. And how do we reflect that, and how do we continue to support and work with those? Because I think that's going to be critical in terms of halting this further slide into the deep grey.
Yep.
Thank you, Sally Ann. Go ahead, Marius.
If the question was if I have any ideas how we can how we can fight this trend of media outlet state media outlets you know, sliding into the worst categories, I think that's a crucial question, but very difficult to answer. And I think it has to do with audience, journalists, of course. First thing. That's working with journalists, I think, is very important. But on the other hand, if we look at countries that have seen really deep deterioration of the public media in the past 10 years, in Europe, for example, in Hungary in 2010, when the current government won the elections, one of the first things they did was to actually fire all the independent journalists of the public media. And since then, the public broadcaster there became a massive state propaganda channel. Yes, I think working with journalists is essential, and we have to think about ways to broaden this debate and involve them in this debate, and also make them aware. I think that's very important, because in some of the countries presented in the study, I was physically present some years ago, not in the past years. There are, in some of these places, journalists working for these media outlets are they really believe in their mission of journalists in the service of the government. They really believe that the mission of the public media, they believe they work for a public media outlet, is to serve the government. And that is a problem, because we have, in some countries, these are large employers. They employ a lot of journalists. And I think this is part of the discussion, how to actually make more journalists more aware of the value that we find in the public service media in general. This is one thing. The second thing, and I think this is really important, and we were talking about audiences, and of course we live in a world where we can reach out to audiences in much easier ways than before. But I think it's really really important to get the younger audiences to think and talk about it. And of course, there are various ways to do that. We have again social media to do that, but I think at a more institutional level, it's really important to raise this awareness, to speak about the media and introduce the media as a subject generally, to tell young people how it actually works through universities, through schools. I think is the only way. The problem is that, again, in the countries in my study that are really gray, you have a problem also with the educational system, because the educational system is also controlled and is led by state propaganda. So there is a problem there. But I think the younger generations are the most important thing at the moment. I think it's very few understand how. First of all, I have students in my class, and we talk about that, and very few actually understand how media generally works, how a story is produced, how much effort and how many resources are needed to actually produce a good journalistic piece. So I think we have to work, and of course there are many other ways to do that. I think advocating as we do as researchers, academics in various fora about the value and the value of independent public service media is important, and there are many ways to support that. But I think thinking about reaching out to audiences, especially the young ones, is the most important.
A lot to unpack here. Sally-Ann says in chat for those on Facebook that she agrees, and the many understand public media as media in the national interest. But I'm hearing this sort of need for deep discussions of what the public service values really are. Because on the other hand, that the remit of supporting national culture, supporting citizenship, all of that can kind of be meshed into the idea of national interest. And this reminds me of Anis Rahman's wonderful work on public service media in the Global South, a online book that he published and as well as his work where he was saying that the Bangladeshi state media has been really important in highlighting local culture in a very different way than he could imagine any other media outlet. So we have this value conversation, and then as well as teaching those values to younger audiences. Vibot Parthasarathi says, the query on the very idea of state media and another query and question about the explanatory nature of the model. Vibot, take it away.
Thanks very much, Minna. Hi, Marius. Thanks for this detail as usual. So I think there are sort of two parts to the kind of idea of the state media. One, of course, is its presence in the market. There is a kind of market presence part of it. And then there is the autonomy part of it. Okay. And I think there's a tension between these two. You could have scenarios where the market presence is very high and autonomy is low. Okay. And of course, the other way around as well. Yeah. So at least in large parts of the South, I think this tension becomes significant when we try and sort of evaluate, for instance, what use would a autonomous state media be if it has a low market presence?
Right. Well, that's a very very relevant question, and it is. Yes, we can look at the state media through that lens, and it's another way to look at that. But what we tried to do here was to. That's why we didn't speak about autonomous media outlets, but we speak about independent media outlets. If you look at the model, we insist on that because yes, there are some. For example, there are publishing houses in Africa where the state has ownership, and some of them are funded by the state. And we included them in the models, in the metrics, because they are with what we try to do here was to map all the media outlets in which the state has an affiliation or has a financial, governance, or editorial connection. But what we looked at, and that's why I agree that this is a very political study, was the editorial independence lens. Yes, there are media outlets that are autonomous from the government. And you can look at that. You can, you have to, I think the research question is different there. What the research question is, what is the autonomy bringing to state media outlets? Could be one. The second would be, what is the connection between, like, I don't know, financial autonomy and editorial independence? That's a very interesting one. And of course, that could be another study. And it's interesting to look at what is the level of, is the increase in the level of funding leading to less autonomy and less editorial independence? Is there a correlation there? So yes, I agree. You can look at that in many ways. But what we really tried to do was not to lose the focus from editorial independence. That's why. Yes.
But I wonder whether the question still remains that if I sort of replace autonomy with independence, then one can still have a scenario whereby there is high level of independence, but low market presence.
Yes.
And therefore, the question would be the same question I would sort of ask as to what would be the value, in a sense, in that, in the kind of salience of that kind of state media. This is hypothetical. I really don't know if that combination actually exists somewhere, But and why I asked this, in a sense, is because it connects with the second sort of question which I had, is that, I mean, the model is clearly a very strong but a descriptive model, and for it to become a kind of explanatory model, it would need to consider what you yourself was saying, a kind of historical sort of understanding as to why the things are the way we actually see them today. And there I'm wondering that, for instance, when was this sort of public character lost? If that could be perhaps, plotted in the kind of historical study, that might sort of tell us something about why the way things are the way we see them. So, for instance, is there any correlation between the loss of this public character of the state media and deregulation in the wider media and communication industry? And that, I think, will sort of make it even more sharper. That will also give a reason, or at least hint at a reason, as to why the grays and the yellows are the way we see them today.
Of course, that would be that's the study I dream about, and for that you have to go back not only to the research notes that we made 20 years ago and 30 years ago, and go back to historical accounts of the state of public media in the world, but I think we have to go back and measure many other things. For example, one thing that accidentally I found in this study was a connection between the loss of the public element in the media and the state of the economy. The more interventionist state economies are, they are more conducive, to losing the public element in the media. Of course, we need much more research. This is something that more like anecdotally that we found during this research. Well, I think if we want to do that and find out the why here, we have to maybe also think about the type of the political power, the type of the governments. Because if you look, for example, in Eastern Europe in the early 90s, you still have the former communists in power, and for almost 10 years, nothing has happened in the state media. They actually made the transition from the communist times to the decade after the 90s, and they tried to actually reform the state media into public media, and nothing happened. And that didn't happen because you had these political groups in power who are used with the old ways. They said, okay, we'll call it public service media, but we want to retain the power in the public. And nothing happened for a decade. So if you look at the political parties in power in some countries, that's another essential factor that will explain the why. And many other things. I think the state of technological development is very important to study. But again, that would be a great study. But I think if you are to look at all these elements in 151 countries, probably we need some people to help. The first question, the first thing that you mentioned about the model, I think that's very important to discuss, and there are various ways of looking at and classifying the state media. We are aware of the various social media networks like Facebook, Twitter already had this project of labeling state media, and they were trying to also find terms affiliated state media. I think Twitter labels them as state connected or something, and that's yes, they are thinking about criteria and all that. You can look at, we thought about autonomy of the public media, and again we found some examples of again publishers, especially in some African countries where the state has a stake in them, and they are autonomous. They operate, they have their own CFO, CEO, and all that. And you can argue that they are autonomous, but they have some of them, not all of them, they have a problem with the editorial independence. And then the question was, my question, very basic question was like, why do I care whether they are financially autonomous if they actually are a propaganda vehicle for the government? I think our research focus should be somewhere else. This doesn't tell me much. So we looked into that, and I think, and again, if you want a study about simply a study about the impact of state media, let's call them generically state media, on the market, you can do that. And you can look at the financial autonomy, the impact they have on the overall market. But that's another study. What we wanted here to understand was how editorially free are state media in the world and how many of them fulfill their public service mission.
Great.
Thank you, Vibod. You already laid out a long list of research themes, and I have to say that having researched sort of Western, Northern European public service media for 20-some years, I was reading this report and my heart sank, because I really did. It highlights so well what a marginal and yet kind of, how would I put it, prominent presence that kind of research has. Marius or anybody else, what do you think we can take from that, the decades of sort of public service broadcasting, public service media research that has focused on the idealized versions and maybe, you know, being a kind of an advocate for that idealized version as well? What can we take and apply to this new situation and these new research challenges?
I can say a few words, but of course I welcome any of our friends who join us to comment on that. I think there are many things to say, but I think one thing that, and I wouldn't think about anyone in particular, but I think one thing that missed was a much stronger connection between the research, the academia, and the advocates, the NGOs. Of course, in the first decade of this century, when I was working with the OSF, there was a very strong advocacy element. By the way, at the time I had no idea what advocacy meant. I learned everything by doing, and all that. I was coming from a journalism background, but I learned the value of that, and I realized that if you do studies and you do not follow up with, you do not share those with the wider population, and you cannot do it by organizing a Zoom event now or writing an article, but you do it by engaging with NGO, civil society organizations that have a larger group of followers and who are engaged in the discussion with various communities and all that. And I'm not saying that this element missed completely, because there were a lot of initiatives where the work was a combination between researchers, academics, and NGOs, but it was not really, that element was not strong enough. It's a lot of the great research that was produced in those years was not presented to policymakers. The pressure on policymakers, especially in some areas, was non-existent. And again, I know very well the Central and Eastern European region, where the politicians, especially those in the 90s, they were never serious about the reform of the state media. I just look back and I remember all the meetings and all the discussions, they were never serious about that. And that missing decade in the reform of the public media in the region was important, had a very negative role over the longer term development of these media outlets. So this is one thing that of course, there are many more, but that's something that we should learn. I think you cannot do much without a very strong engagement of civil society at large, and of course you can do that through organizations that work at the grassroots level in many of these countries.
Another thing that you already brought about, but I would love to revisit and also ask Astrid as a young scholar about this. You talked about the necessity to reach young audiences, and in sort of Western mature PSM countries, we have learned that sort of the values of young people and the values of public service media broadly, they are in line. The idea of inclusion and serving all citizens, promoting democracy, diverse voices, focus on issues such as the environment and different burning political issues and debates, all of that. In a way, the young audiences are discussing this. Young activists are working on platforms, on the sort of commercial platforms, doing advocacy there. How can we build a awareness and connections, these kind of connections? And I would like to ask first from Astrid, as a young person, as a researcher who has been involved in this study.
Oh, thank you. It's a big question to answer. I've been also thinking about this. Of course, I joined Marius and CMDS really recently, and I'm already only starting to work on a field. I do care a lot about media independence, and I care about the state media's position and the use and misuse of state media's position in the society. And I think also because I come from a background where state media has really this strong basis as in the idea of public service for the citizens, not public service for the state. What I've been worried about lately is how especially young people are getting disengaged and in media. And of course, state media is not the only one to blame. There's a lot going on in the media ecosystem and our developments, and there's a lot of going on in politics overall, in polarization, in radicalization. But I think state media has an important role in the norms of objective journalism and continuing object journalism. So that's why objective journalism. That's why I think this study is really important, and I want to continue to work probably with this study, with this topic, with this methodology, because it provides a really good, like a specific scientific detailed way to look at really the reasons behind this media capture and the misuse of state role in the media ecosystem. And because after all, like to really understand the solutions, we first have to look at the reasons really specifically. So this is why I was really happy to work with Marius in this study.
Thank you, Astrid. And Astrid and I, we both come from Finland, and we see the fact that since, for instance, YLE in Finland isn't fully independent, we see what is starting to happen, how commercial competitors and political adversaries are trying to undermine because there is this sort of financial connection, a state connection there, so we can start to see that. So I personally love that part of this study that you really give a nuanced scale of what to look at. But something that we haven't really discussed, and this is my last question, that has to do with independent media outlets that are not necessarily institutional. And I'm, of course, thinking about our Nobel laureate, Maria Ressa, and her outlet, and the way she sort of completely dismantled the model that she knew from CNN and started to do a very different kind of media and with direct connection to the audiences. How do you see the role of those kind of small media in this ecosystem of public interest that we want to support and that is necessary? Although, Marius, you did say we need these institutions, but how do we see the role of these kind of smaller projects or smaller initiatives?
Right. Well, I think what I said was that I'm not sure we need these institutions, especially many of them. But what we need is is to really understand the value of public service media, and whoever is preserving that in whatever form, I think that's fine with me, and we should support that. Of course, again, in some countries, you have institutions that have a long tradition and that have the infrastructure and the resources to do that. Unfortunately, this is happening only in some Western European countries. In others, they have the infrastructure, they have the resources, but they remain state propaganda channels, and that is a problem. But to answer your question, I think any kind of media outlets or initiative that is supporting the space and creating the space for independent journalism and for high quality content, which are, I strongly believe, two of the areas where the public service media should play an important role, should be supported. Now the discussion, of course, is long, and it's going to become even more complicated, especially at the funding level, with the pressure from various other forms of funding of media online. The discussion is going to become extremely complicated when it comes to governance structures, and again, this is because the many governments all over the place will try to retain control over many media as possible. So I think we are going to be faced with a very complex debate in a context where some of these players, the state media is one of them, gain more and more power. And now what I wanted to also highlight was the fact that this is just state media is just one of the players. Of course, it's huge, and it has in many countries it plays an overwhelming role, and that's why we have studied them. They access public resources, and we have studied them because that's a transparency related issue. But there are many other the media outlets out there. We haven't included here, of course, media outlets that are controlled by individual politicians. We had a long methodological discussion there. Shall we do that? But without a state connection, we didn't include those. That's another problem in many countries where you have politicians or people who buy media to pursue their own interests. You have a situation of private media outlets that are growing through various political groups, and again, they are not owned by politicians in power, so to speak, but they are controlled by various groups of interest. So the situation is getting even bleaker if we go beyond the state media. But whatever is going to happen, I think what we have to really support is any form or format of media that allows for the growth and the space for independent journalism. That's going to be the big fight of the next decade, I believe.
The big fight, and you've contributed to that conversation, so we can have it in a more nuanced and intelligent way forward. So just final words, Marius, maybe Astrid, what are the next steps? You hinted that there are some papers coming out. What can we look forward to?
Yeah, we are working on a number of other 2 or 3 papers based on the research that we have collected. One idea is to go more in detail into each of these areas, funding, governance, editorial independence. There are many other groups out there that are doing great work there, and we are following that as well. And we want to do that also to complement that work. And we also identified a lot of research gaps. One of them, and we don't have an idea how to tackle it, is a study that we look more in a much more detail into the journalistic community employed by state media. Of course, there have been people doing studies like that, but I was wondering one day, do we actually know these people? Of course, I'm not talking about, profiling 1 million people in all the state media in the world. That's impossible. But I think a study looking at the values driving journalists working in this media would be extremely, extremely valuable, because not so many people looked into that. We are not planning to do that for the moment. I would be glad to hear if somebody else would do that, because that's something that is really important.
Thank you, Marius Dragomir. Thank you, Astrid. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for this conversation, and let's continue it. You can find the report here on chat as well as on Facebook chat. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much, Minna, and all of you.